So right now we have like new additional materials to our research. And I'm responsible for doing research on humanitarian law violations. So I'm quite focused on identifying some patterns when we talk about Russia and Russian attitude to law. And unfortunately, taking into account Russia's wars, which were mentioned in Chechnya, also Russian participation in Syria, it was, and of course, we should also have in mind the whole historical concept, also USSR crimes, and the Second World War. So the situation in Ukraine, unfortunately, was not surprised. And I believe we can say that Russia uses war crimes and international crimes as a kind of tool of war. In strategic studies, there is like a new fashionable word, weaponization. So sometimes we can say that we observe weaponization of war crimes. What are arguments which supports this thesis? So first of all, the scale of crimes in Ukraine. When we analyze crimes, first of all, we can see what kind of how hostilities, how attacks are organized, and as we know, attacks can be only directed against military objectives. So generally speaking, all other attacks which are not against a strict military objective is forbidden. But taking into account the scale of bombardments, weapon which is used, unfortunately also civilian objectives are targeted. Of course, when we know that when civilian target is used for military purposes, it loses its status and can be attacked. So to be honest, the final assessment of the situation in Ukraine has to wait because every crime needs to be proved. And of course, there are Ukrainian prosecutors, there are international staff in the field which gather evidence. But taking into account the scale, systematic character of attacks against civilians, we can say it is a tool. Then the question of vital infrastructure, which especially we could observe in the winter time, it can be, of course, identified as a military objective, but taking into account the scale, weapon which was used against those targets, we can say that the goal was to humiliate somehow, to put a pressure on civilian population in Ukraine. Then attacking objectives which are supportive for civilian populations. So, for example, the question of food, which was a very serious one, the question that also fields are bombed, mines, anti-personnel mines are used, also shows that the target is the civilian population. And the question of humanitarian aid, problems with protection, guarantees for humanitarian corridors, and very similar patterns were observed in Syria. Our colleagues from medical staff, humanitarian workers who were in Syria, they told us that when the Russian army, for example, announced guarantees for one way, they knew that this way should be avoided because probably it would be bombed. And especially at the beginning of the conflict, very similar behavior could be observed in Ukraine. Attacking medical staff, like hundreds of medical objectives were attacked, destroyed in Ukraine. And as you know, also Polish medical staff, which is present near Bakhmut, near the front, they don't use the Red Cross because at the very beginning they could see that the Red Cross emblem, which would be protective, is just the target. So, of course, those are challenges for international humanitarian law. Another question, occupation. So what is human rights situation, humanitarian situation on occupied territories? We know that from international humanitarian law point of view, the occupying power is responsible for security, safety of civilian population. It should provide medical support, food, water, everything what is needed for the population. But unfortunately, we could observe crimes. Like Bucha was just one example. We could observe transferring of children from occupying territories to Russia, to Crimea, to Russia. We could observe torturing, rapes, also destruction of some cultural items, and so famous infiltration camps, which we know, which we could also see during Chechen wars. Different international missions were able to provide evidence of really all those horrible crimes. And what kind of factors are important? The question of how Russian army is organized. From our research, we can say that there is no education in Russian army when we talk about international humanitarian law. So this is the problem. The problem is that those combatants, those soldiers who, for example, committed crimes in Chechnya, who were responsible for those filtration camps, who were responsible for organizing direct attacks against civilians, they were promoted in the army. So a part of the culture is that committing army sometimes is perceived as a kind of loyalty for expressing loyalty for the state. So those soldiers who proved that kind of loyalty in Chechnya, then they were in Georgia and especially in Syria and today in Ukraine. So that's why it's another question is that Russia as a state has was never punished for crimes which were committed. There are some cases in the European Court of Human Rights. So some human rights violations, let's say, were decided by the court. Some compensations were paid. But we know that Russia is not more a member of the Council of Europe. So historically speaking, there is no awareness of justice, punishment. During the first war in Chechnya, some officers responsible for crimes were punished. It was the term of President Yeltsin. But since Putin's term, nothing like that has happened. So the question of the culture approach to justice, punishment is the problem. And in the end, I would like to say that from what kind of conclusions can we draw from the situation? But first of all, of course, international humanitarian law is not respected, and there is no idea right now how to improve international humanitarian law, because there were some initiatives, but it turned out that states today wouldn't be ready to ratify Geneva Conventions, additional protocols, etc., etc. But at the same time, from international order point of view, of course, the question of identifying of crimes which are committed and all those efforts to justice, which you observe in ICC, International Criminal Court, in Ukraine, in Europe, there are quite many states are involved to help Ukraine to gather evidence and to punish those who are responsible for crimes. There is also an idea to establish a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. And as far as we know, what is the crucial factor that European Union supports this idea, and also the United States last week started saying that it could be possible to have such a tribunal, which would be based on probably Ukrainian law, but at the same time would be internationalized somehow. So, so that's just the idea. But from Poland's point of view, I noticed, for example, around 2 weeks ago in Warsaw, there was like big conference concerning preparedness of Polish civilian population for possible war. And I noticed that all like panels were focused on protection of the population against some weapon, against attack. There were quite many discussions about the shelter, but no discussion about the situation of occupation, because it is something what really doesn't work in Ukraine. We so far we have believed that the occupying power would just respect and protect the civilian population. But the discussion in the United States started how to prepare armed forces, how to prepare the population for the situation of the occupying power, which really doesn't respect human rights, international humanitarian law obligations, etc., etc. I'm afraid my time is over, so thank you, and I will come back to some factors maybe.
4 or 5 minutes if you need them. However, if not, we can proceed. It's up to you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Before we proceed to the second presentation, I just want to thank you for saying that there is a continuity in Russian policy. The same happens in Chechnya, for example. On the one hand, that's quite obvious, but on the other hand, many experts and commentators tend to forget that this is part of Russian approach to waging a war. And also, I will ask you later about this, the children issue. You used the word transferring, I would say, or the kidnapping children, which I would say is one of the most shocking elements of war crimes, of how you wage a war and how you try to, intimidate your enemy. So during the
just say that in case of Chechnya, the wars in Chechnya were considered by the international community as Russian internal affairs. There was no serious debate about crimes which were committed. Like Grozny was completely destroyed. It looked like Warsaw after the Second World War. But international organizations, Western states, just preferred, avoided the discussion. So they might be surprised when we talk about crimes in Ukraine. But in Poland, the experts in Poland are more aware of the situation.
Okay. Thank you very much. So now we can proceed to the second panelist. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Actually, I would like to start my presentation without PowerPoint with a quote of the head of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of France, Thierry Burkhard. And he said that the information space today is a place of a real information warfare. It's been said when he was presenting the doctrine LD, which is translated as, roughly translated into English as cyber information warfare. It's the best translation I could come up. Lutte informatique d'influence. Actually, information influence warfare. And we all know that the foreign policy objectives are rarely achieved through the diplomatic ways only. They often need some other means and ways to be achieved. So, speaking of paramilitary organizations, it is really interesting because the very first presenter said, who spoke about Ukraine, he said that there was Maidan, revolution, etc. But interesting issue is that in 2006, actually I've been taking notes at the same time, in 2006, the Eurasian movement of Dugin, the Russian Eurasian movement, was present in Ukraine, and they have created funded by Russia actually, the Donetsk Republic NGO. And in 2006, they have carried out a referendum for the independence of this Donetsk Republic. It's quite interesting actually, but you will see why later in my speech. It is also well known that some paramilitary units, for example, took part in the Rwandan genocide, For example, Wagner has been present in Syria since 2013, when it was still a small group of roughly 200, 300 people. But I would like actually to make a transition to information confrontation. Information confrontation is a Russian concept, and how Russia sees the different actions on the international arena and different actions of influence. For example, during the Cold War, there were some terms like disinformation. It actually came back right now. Today we hear about it a lot. There were also active measures. Those were the actions directed at basically influencing the public opinion through different ways, through corruption, through killing people, through blackmailing people, for example, the honeypots, infamous honeypots, and for example, through acquisition of media to actually influence the people's mind. But with the introduction of internet and the blossom of social media, the influence of the public opinion became, let's put it this way, quite easier, because you don't really have right now to own media in a targeted country. For example, Russians don't need to have a media in Poland to be able to influence the mind of Poles or French or whatever, even though we had the RT and the Sputnik offices. Should be said that basically Russians, they started to work on the information warfare was provoked by the war in the Gulf. And then at that period there was Colonel Sergei Komov who actually developed the Russian way of information warfare. But back then it was considered purely through the kinetic warfare prism or lens, if you want. So basically, those were the informations. We in France call them, for instance, OMI, Opération Militaire d'Influence, military information of military operations of influence. And for instance, those are measures that have to impact the public opinion when there is a deployment of troops overseas, or for example during the hostilities. But at the same time, if we read the Russian doctrinal documents, we can, for example, even quote the 2000, for example, the military doctrine. We can quote the national security strategy. We can quote the strategy of information security. They're actually quite different documents in Russia. They all refer to, as early as 2000, to information confrontation. They don't use the word information warfare. They don't use some other words. And my guess is because actually Russians use the Western word, so basically information warfare would be rather used as to describe what Russians see as hostile actions carried out by the Western countries. And so for their bureaucracy, they invent their own words. And for instance, the information confrontation. And this information confrontation includes everything: cyber operations, espionage, different actions, disinformation, etc., etc. And actually quite, I would like to give you two examples that I personally adore of the Soviet at that time active measures. One, it was the Operation Storm 333 in Afghanistan in 1979, actually before and during the storm of the Hafizullah Amin palace and the change of regime in Afghanistan. At that time, Soviets actually recruited the people from Central Asian republics who spoke the local language. They have transported them there, and they stayed undercover. And then, when they were storming the Hafizullah Amin palace, basically it was presented as it was the Afghan people who is fighting against Hafizullah Amin, but those were Soviet Spetsnaz forces, drafted and selected from the Central Asian republics. And another very interesting, in my opinion, example is the Operation Tukan, It happened in Chile during the Augusto Pinochet rule, and the Soviets carried out those active measures together with their Cuban colleagues from intelligence to actually discredit the leader of Chile. So basically, to say this information confrontation concept became, let's put it this way, a blended, that it blended in itself almost everything from active measures and cyber attacks to disinformation and reflexive control. I have already mentioned the Russian documents, and maybe I'll go to subversion, actually, because we were talking about, yet again, the first presenter spoke about Ukraine, and it's quite interesting because subversion is also a part of information confrontation. And here I'd like to quote a very famous French book, La Subversion. And the author, he has cited basically three actions on public opinion and three objectives to actually to impact the public opinion. So one, and some of people here will basically recognize those in terms of disinformation, and I can say, hello, Michal. To demoralize the nation and disintegrate the groups that compose it, to discredit the authority, its defenders, its state employees, neutralize the masses to make impossible any general spontaneous intervention in favor of the established order in a chosen moment in order to take power in a non-violent way by a small minority. So you understand, so basically the idea is to impact the public opinion and then to achieve your political goals, because at the same time, the main idea is the political goal you should achieve, with the military actually intervention being the last resort to achieve the political goals. Here also we can quote the non-doctrine of Gerasimov. It's basically an article that was published in 2013 in a Russian magazine. The article, I believe a lot of people know this article. It is entitled "The Value of Science in Forecasting," and where he basically spoke about the impact of public opinion, but basically by the Americans and general West on the countries like the Arab Spring, the Arab countries with those events, the early 2010s as Arab Spring, we know, and color revolutions. Going back to actually French information resilience, because we have already discussed it this morning that for every country the approach and the narrative would be different. There are some meta-narratives that are mostly the same for example, for the member states of the European Union and NATO, but there are also narratives that are invented especially for that or this society. So for example, a narrative that would not be possible in Poland because for example, ethnic composition of Poland is different than the ethnic composition of France. In France, we have different groups of, mostly the whole world came to France at some point, and we have people from Mali who are French or who are migrants, it doesn't matter, who are from North Africa, who are from China, etc., etc., etc. And as you understand, the subversion is somehow the core of those information operations, because the idea is to impact the public opinion and to achieve your political goal. For example, today it would be to stir up the protest in this or that country. So speaking about French information resilience, and then I'll actually talk about Africa. In France, at some point, we were quite unwary about this problem, saying that, not really unwary, but we took it with easiness. We didn't really think that it may really concern us. But for the first time, my memory, for the first time, the issues of misinformation, we call it often misinformation, were quoted in the national security strategy that was published a few months after Macron first arrived in power in 2017. Then there was this, I will actually quote a few documents so you would understand the progression. We had a ministerial policy of defensive cyber warfare that was published in 2018 or 19. And we have a military doctrine of offensive cyber warfare. And that's actually in that doctrine, for the first time, there was this notion of information operations, information warfare, basically. Then we had a strategic update that basically reviewed and confirmed the assumptions that were made in 2017 with the national security strategy, with highlighting even more importance of this information for France, for French national security. Then we have military doctrine of cyber influence warfare, I just quoted, in 2021, and it's very interesting because in this doctrine, basically France recognized that we are waging the information warfare. And prior to this, in 2020, there was a report, just a short remark, there was a report done by Graphica showing that in Africa, Russians and French were engaged in information warfare on social media, and where we were defending and Russians mostly were attacking. And the last one, it was National Strategic Review in 2022, and yet again, those issues of disinformation and information warfare are high on the agenda. But it is worth noting that there are also two documents that were drafted in 2000s. It's DS 3.10 and DS 3.10.1. Information of first document, information operations, and another one is military operations of influence. I have already mentioned this earlier, and it is interesting because, yet again, those were when Russians were working on information warfare as a part of information, as a part of the military, for example, campaign or military engagement. In France, we worked as well on the same and basically in the same years, maybe with a bit time lag, but still. Also, the information operations that accompany actually our troops, because as you know, they have troops in some countries, mostly in Africa, but still. And I would like to quote you actually the definition of information operations as given in the document. So information operations are made of different actions carried out by the armed forces, directed and coordinated on the highest level, aiming to use or to defend information systems of information and decision-making processes in order to appuyer la stratégie d'influence. To support the strategy of influence and to contribute, enhance the strategy of influence and to contribute in the framework of operations to achieve the final aim respecting the defended values. And military operations of influence regroup different activities with the aim to obtain and affect on the behavior of individuals, groups of, or organizations that are called info aims, info cible in French, in order to contribute to achieving the political and military objectives. But that's with regard to the military aspect. With regard of the more civil aspect, we have a very important legislation that were adopted in 2018. It was a law on disinformation. It was law number 2018-1202 on the fight against manipulation of information. This legislation for the first time introduced
3 minutes.
Okay, so I'll skip this, and actually I'll talk as well about Visionum. It is an organization that was created in 2001 that became operational in October. And this operation, if we talk about information warfare, so basically we have a cyber command which is responsible for the defense of France overseas. Speaking of the cyber and information operations, and if you have Visionum, Visionum has only prerogatives to work on the French soil or French information space, if you want to understand, to analyze the trends and information impacts. And just actually going back to Africa, because I understand I don't have much time, but maybe I'll add up something during the questions. Different anti-French manifestations, for example, in Mali, in Central African Republic, for example, where Wagner was operating and is still operating actually with the Prigozhin's firm Lobaya Invest having the mines actually, and the Wagner is protecting this. So basically, in Mali, there were different, basically NGOs that worked with close cooperation, in close cooperation with Russia, and who were creating, actually capitalizing on the anti-French sentiment, creating the different mass protests, demonstrations, actually demanding the France to withdraw troops from Mali. And as we know, Russian Wagner, which often is referred to as a private military company, but we know that in Russia there is no legal status for private military companies, came to Mali, and currently the situation is quite difficult because in some parts the terrorism became more important because with the war in Ukraine, Wagner should diminish their troops in the country. But still, there was Burkina Faso, and I believe in future we will also face the important anti-French manifestations and activities carried out by Russia in Chad. Because in Chad there is uranium, and France's Areva is exploiting uranium there, and for Russians it would be important to actually cut this out. So I'd be glad to actually develop my ideas and points during the questions.
Thank you. If we have time, I will ask you about Africa. Chad is also a good connector between North Africa and also Sahel. So for Russia, it's very important. Thank you very much. I must say that I'm not an expert, but information warfare is one of topics I really like to explore. Let me use my privilege as a moderator, or maybe abuse my right to ask you a question right now. I remember that before the war, in 2022, there were many comments saying, or opinions saying that, you know, Russian information warfare is very sophisticated, that they spend a lot of money, time, resources to develop different systems, that they have also experience from the Soviet times. You know, they are very good at doing some subversion. And now we have a war in Ukraine, and there's also this so-called doctrine of Gerasimov that you can win a war without using troops, you can influence society. And now we have a war in Ukraine, and the Russian propaganda campaign, I would say, is a big disaster, at least in Europe.
I wouldn't actually completely agree with you.
That's even better.
So that's a question.
That's a question. One, that's my point of view, that we tend to think that they are perfect, and now, at least from my point of view, at least I have to provoke you. It is a disaster. If you compare that to Ukrainian side, when they are very efficient in propaganda, you know, they use the internet, they use different memes to promote their point of view. And Russians are seen as losers and you know, idiots.
I will tell you this. When the war started, the Russian narratives weren't really well received. But when the war progressed, and starting from last summer, we observed actually that the Russian narratives started to receive more shares, likes, and engagement on, for example, on Twitter and actually on other social media as well. But we always tend to see the information warfare or information confrontation, if you use the Russian wording, as an action from Russia to another country, for example, France. Let's put it France. But it's actually what I wanted to say at the beginning of my presentation, but I completely forgot. And it is good that you've asked this question. For example, I've talked about that every country has its own vulnerabilities, let's put it this way. In France, from the point of view of Russian information warfare, our vulnerability is the fact that France is not a mono-ethnic country. So we have very different people from very different nations. A lot of languages are spoken in France as well. And for example, in my opinion, the most dangerous and dangerous Russian information activities against France are not happening directly in France or through France. They're happening through Africa. Because, for example, I'll give you, just in a few seconds, I'll give you some figures. Interesting thing, Russia and Russian propaganda outlets, RT, Sputnik, etc., they put their content for free to use. So every media, and we know that, for example, in Africa, even in the Balkan countries, and in Northern Africa, the media, they don't have a lot of money actually to produce their own content. So with regard to in international issues, they use and reutilize the Russian content. And Russian content is basically already written in that way that presents Russia, for example, in some issues as a victim, defending itself, then the aggressive West is trying to destroy Russia, etc., etc. And those narratives are coming, for example, to, let's put it this, because I have this example, come to Algeria. So Algerian news, take it from the Russian news. Sometimes they translate it, sometimes they just take it because it's available in Arabic language. And another interesting figure I'd like to give you is actually the figures from 2017-2018 poll, and it's actually traffic per site, and RT in Arabic and Sputnik in Arabic altogether outpace all other foreign outlets broadcasting the content in Arabic language. So basically, if you're an Arab speaker and you Google things in Arabic language, you have a lot of possibilities, much more, let's say, possibilities to find the Russian content in Arabic language than, let's say, CNN in Arabic. And here, why it is dangerous, and I'm talking about France, why it is dangerous, because, for example, we take the website APS.DZ, it's for Algeria, DZ. So it's a news outlet, one of the famous ones in Algeria, and for the last month, it had 1.2 million visits per month. Of them, 60% come from Algeria and 22 come from France. And actually, I've done some comparison 2 years ago or a year and a half ago. You take almost every media in Western Africa and in Northern Africa, and you still have from 10 to 40% actually audiences coming from France, which means that in a quite discrete way, the vision of the world of those people, of those readers, of those users is shaped by Russia. It's shaped on the French soil by Russia and through non-French and even non-Russian media.
So how come there is no French-based Arabic spoken media?
We have a lot, even France 24. We have France 24 in Arabic, we have RMC, if I'm not mistaken, and others. But the thing is that the RT in Arabic was the most, I just give you figures, for example, Russian RT in Arabic had almost 24 million visits per month, while Al Arabiya, 17 million.
Okay. Thank you very much. We can go back to this issue later on. So now let's move to Bulgaria. Are you with us?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you. We can see you. Do you have a presentation?
No, just speaking. Boring speaking.
No, that's fine. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for...
You have around more or less 15 minutes, more or less.
Yeah, this is totally enough. Thank you again for this invitation, and I hope next time to be in person with you. I wish to be there. Unfortunately, I have assignments in Bulgaria because of the situation here in the Balkans at all. And I would like also to discuss the previous panels, because it's very interesting for me also as part of my job in Atlantic Council of countering information operations in the Balkans and Eastern Europe. I believe that we can exchange ideas and know-how knowledge, how to counter and how to detect such information operations. And also Wagner and all other proxy forces used by Russia are part of this narrative and campaign. I will present some historical background because For me, it is very important for the story how we understand Wagner, and not only Wagner, because you already mentioned in the beginning of our panel that we can speak about a whole campaign and network of groups, and Wagner is just the most popular group. So I'll be happy to discuss with you later. And how a military unit has become a media sensation is a question that can be asked frankly when we talk about Wagner. And over the last few years, a number of in-depth investigations have been brought to the Russian mercenaries who have disgusted some because of their brutal methods. We already witnessed it in the past few days, another brutal videos from Wagner unit. And researchers and journalists discuss with enthusiasm, let's say, the latest video footages published in one or another Telegram channel linked to Wagner. By the way, there are dozens of channels linked to the Wagner and military intelligence of Russia. And the statements of the group financier, the oligarch Evgeny Prigozhin. I call him financier, not owner, because this is a very specific thing for Wagner and how such groups are operating, and how the military complex of Russian Federation are using and creating such groups, including the latest one called Convoy, based in Crimea. And Prigozhin became the basis of debates, articles, quarrels, even. This is just part of the obsession created around Wagner in Russia and through the internet outside the country. The Wagner comics are spreading. There are many such comics and graphic novels based on Wagner activity, created by sympathizers and members of the group. There are even hip-hop tracks glorifying the history of Wagner. The whole story around the group is breathtaking. We should understand that, but except that is totally made up and is part of the Kremlin narratives sold to the audience, including and mainly in the West. Since 2014, when Moscow has taken steps to annex Crimea, Kremlin political technologists have created several narratives to dispel public opinion from active hostilities and to have created, let's say, myths or legends that have been spread to this day. On one side, the story of the existence of separatists in eastern Ukraine was absolutely and clearly created by the Kremlin. Although there is a definite evidence that in 2014, outside Ukraine, Russia used military forces without marking in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, the audience outside Ukraine believes that the Ukrainian army fought with separatists who want to join Russia. In this context, Russia has created the other part of the story, let's say mysterious band of mercenaries, which the Kremlin denies even exist, as one of the panelists already mentioned that it is illegal still in Russian Federation, but always appear where Moscow has interest, including and during the annexation of Crimea. I first came across Wagner while tracking the Syrian civil war in the early years of the conflict. In 2014, it became clear that the Kremlin has using irregular units to cover up its active military involvement in Ukraine and in other areas of the world. In this already long ago time, the signals were still fragments cut with speeches by officials, the occasional social media posts and news reports. The pattern began to become clear with each step that Wagner was not just an ordinary mercenary company, or let's say in the Western meaning of this term, and that the Kremlin is seeing not just Ukraine or Syria as a global arena of competition, global geopolitical competition. As the previous panelists already mentioned, France and sub-Saharan Africa, also west and eastern part of Africa too. And in 2004, in 2023, when we watch the footage from Ukraine battlefields, there is hardly anyone who was not heard to Wagner. Unfortunately, decision makers still take, let's say, simplistic view of entities like Wagner and the events they provoke. From my point of view, it is very important to discuss the effect of Wagner, not Wagner itself, but we can discuss later this. Officially, Wagner started out as a low-level contractor and mostly as a private security company. Until 2011, the man and the future commander of the unit, Dmitry Utkin, served as in the Russian Special Forces Spetsnaz, and after retirement, he became part of the private security company called Moron Security Group, which provides protection for commercial vessels. In 2013, the MSG formed the so-called Slavonic Corps, which is around 300, it was around 300 strong unit that was sent to Syria after being contracted by the Syrian regime to guard key energy sites, first in the province of Latakia on the sea, and then in the region of Deir Zor in the eastern part of Syria, and the town of As-Sukhna. But the Slavonic Corps was ambushed by the Islamic State in October the same year, and the mercenaries were withdrawn back to Russia. At that time, Slavonic Corps was mostly connected to FSB, not GRU, like Wagner later. And it was a disaster for Russian security agencies. So all the people returned to Russia, they were arrested on the airport, and we don't know what's happened after that. And Dmitry Utkin used his connections and opportunities for financial security to form a new detachment around himself and tested it successfully in Ukraine in the next year, 2014, and then in Syria after the Russian intervention in 2015. And then the well-known PMC Wagner came into the world stage. So for almost 3 years, my colleague Kirill Vramov and I have been tracking the evolution of Russian mercenary model and the articles we wrote at that period, which became the basis of our book later. It's called Russian Invisible Armies, confirmed our conclusion that mercenaries that Russia use are deeply connected to the state and the security apparatus and are part of, let's say, that a package of services the Kremlin is providing to its allies, like in Africa or Syria or Libya. This package is part of Russian current foreign policy strategy to expand its areas of influence and gain access to important resources, which is especially important for its economy due to the international sanctions. This is one of the ways how Russia is providing resources through Sudan, for example, and Central African Republic. They are delivering gold and other resources to Russia and through Iran and China. So this is one of the ways how they bypassing sanctions. And sending mercenaries is also and semi-official fighters, let's say, with unmarked uniforms, created this possibility of manageable chaos and state of denial. Russia is doing the same in its military adventures from Syria to Africa, but also in Ukraine. And it was already mentioned by the previous panelist. I want also to say again that Wagner is primarily a military unit that is part of the wider army network of the Russian Ministry of Defense and the security apparatus linked to GRU or military intelligence of Russia. Wagner is also a multi-layered organization, which is very important to be discussed and explained. The group is operating within and never outside the framework of the Russian army and in particular Spetsnaz. They are already and always fighting together with Spetsnaz. What we know as Wagner today began, as I already taught, in 2014 in the context of the Kremlin new missions in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. But Wagner's prototype are long before this. And we should mention also it is a product of a long historical development from Imperial Russia and the, let's say, Persian Cossacks Brigade, which is very interesting prototype for today irregular Russian forces in the 19th century, through the USSR in the first invasion of Afghanistan of the Soviet army is at the beginning of 20th century in Afghanistan. Then in the most famous intervention is 80s by Soviet army, but they are using the so-called Muslim battalions, which is one of the prototypes of Wagner and Slavonic Corps. And we also should mention the Yugoslavian wars, where Russian voluntary detachments, the so-called RDOs, in Yugoslavia and later in Ukraine and Syria after the intervention. Afghanistan has a very prominent place in the Soviet and post-Soviet Russian mercenary model. By the end of 1978, the Soviet Union had a strong influence over the security forces of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, which is the name of then country. And in the mid of the next year, the battles against anti-Soviet partisans forces in the face of Mujahideen forces are not going well for the government. I will later explain why I share information for that period, because that period is one of the most important for developing Russian model of how they are using such proxies in the not only in history but also today. So at that time, after strong resistance in the western Afghan city of Herat, the then President Nur Muhammad Taraki called the Soviet Prime Minister Kosygin and asked the Soviet Union to intervene with military force. First, they declined this request, but after that, the Soviet army decided to intervene with military force, and in the spring of the next year, Moscow sent helicopters, aircraft, a signal center, and paratrooper battalion to Bagram Air Base. All through the military personnel as Soviet, the markings on the helicopters are Afghan. The crew and every soldier wear Afghan uniforms. So a month after the conversation between Taraki and Kosygin, the Soviet General Staff formed this combat group that became known as the Muslim Battalion. This is the first such detachment, but officially it's registered as Special Organization Division number 154. So this event changed forever not only the history of Afghanistan, but also set an example of how special units of the Soviet army and later Russian army could be used in local conditions in order to cover traces of the official Kremlin. How much minutes I have? Because yeah, I don't. Yeah.
One or two.
Okay.
In fact, you have none, but let's say you have.
Okay. I can share later this historical context, but in general, historical context from Afghanistan through Yugoslavian wars are very important for development of this model, which Russia is using today in Ukraine, Syria, Libya, Central African Republic, and other countries. So the most important is Afghan example, Yugoslavian wars, Chechen wars, because many of the commanders of Wagner unit are coming from the Chechen wars in 90s. And also the core of the team in Wagner is presented in Syria and Libya. And one of the most important things for this network because Wagner is part of much wider networks, which is connected to far-right groups in the Western Europe, but also a network of so-called patriotic camps across Eastern Europe and the Balkans. So Wagner is just part of this network Kremlin is developing for the past decade, and the network is connected itself between the groups inside. So we have political parties supported by the Kremlin. On the other side, we have nationalistic movements supported by pro-Russian groups, like in Bulgaria. We have such examples. Also, we have examples from Western and Northern Europe, and the whole network is actually providing volunteers to Donbass front lines. So in short, this is the network we are discussing, and why for me it's important to speak not just for Wagner, because Wagner is a military unit, and in general they are providing services to the military. But the effect and legends created by Wagner and the Kremlin have much long-time consequences for the Balkans and Eastern Europe, which is the region Russia considers its influence.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So before we start our question and answers session, let me ask you two questions, very short questions. I mean, questions are short, but maybe answers will be long. So Wagner and other groups are known as PMCs, right? Private military companies. And you already mentioned that, but maybe you could add something. But would you really call them private? I mean, are there really private companies which are paid by the government, or they are semi-state-owned companies? So this is my first question. And the second one is, why did Russia decided to, or why they are now using Wagner in Africa? I mean, one of the most important advantages of using such groups is that you can conduct a secret operation, right? But everyone knows that Wagner is in Africa. If you talk with French experts, they will give you numbers. In that country, you have that number of Wagner guys. In that country, you have Wagner group. So there is not even a small level of secrecy, of clandestine operation. So what makes them much more attractive in Africa than, I don't know, Spetsnaz or airborne units of the Russian army?
So for the first question, to me and my colleagues, we should not call Wagner PMC, because the PMC have different meaning in Europe, in Western tradition also, and it's also not connected even to the Russian historical context. Russia and Imperial Russia or Soviet Union, they used such irregular forces, but through the whole history of Russia, all of these units were connected directly to the military and the security agencies in Petersburg or Moscow. So in that meaning, the whole myth and legend created by the Kremlin that there is one band of mercenaries somewhere which is pro-Russian but not directly linked to the Kremlin, this is a narrative we are unfortunately repeating by media reports, but in researching researchers community, it's I think this is already well known that Wagner is not a PMC, but let's say integrated unit in the military, because the model is very simple. Russia, and this is connected to the second question, Russia right now under Putin rule have no resource to send regular troops to allies. But in the same time, they need the presence there. For example, in Central African Republic and Libya, Wagner are actually military unit linked and backed by the Russian military. They received military jets, transportation, and other assets, including tools for electronic warfare. So Wagner is acting by, how to say, it's a unit created by military intelligence, but with resources of businessmen, like Prigozhin. But it could be anyone. Prigozhin is just one of the many business persons supporting such groups. And this new unit convoy in Crimea is supported by another oligarch. So the model is very simple, but very useful for Russia. For the outside world, it's I think it's a question of exotic thing. I mean, the Western audience is not understanding how these informal networks are working. But in Eastern Europe, we know very well how this network is working. So this state of denial of units and the presence is part of the narrative, part of a modus operandi of the Kremlin. And in Central African Republic is proved to be very successful. But in Syria and last year in Ukraine, the model of how Wagner are operating changed because Wagner became a military unit on the front line. Before that, it was just providing security group.
And speaking, that's my last question, I promise. Speaking of Prigozhin, do you think that if he was killed by a suicide or any other option, that the Wagner group would survive, or that would be also the end of that group without Prigozhin?
We have, for example, from Slavonic Corps. This group was destroyed in Syria, but members of the group just changed the owner, I mean the financier. And yeah, maybe the owner, because on that time, GRU become more aggressive to FSB and the other security agencies in the Kremlin. So they just take over the model. And right now it is visibly more successful than the previous prototypes of Wagner. And I don't believe Wagner will disappear. Maybe it will be like an odd group. I'm not sure if you are aware of this group, but in Western Balkans, it was very popular, and Belarus also, because they created the patriotic camps, provided volunteers to Donbass front lines. The Enot group became very big problem for security apparatus in the Kremlin, because the main commander of Enot became very critical to Kremlin because of Eastern Ukraine and not supporting enough the forces there. So Enot was disbanded, but all members actually created another groups, and it's now under another name, just another name. So they continue the same activity.
Thank you very much. We have around 26 minutes for questions. Do we have any questions? Gentlemen, please.
I have a very short comment actually to what I've said previously, and it's about the Central Africa information warfare and then information influence I work. Actually, interesting thing, there is a website, a radio, which is called Lengo Songo. It treats different subjects of Central African Republic, etc. And a funny thing that the obvious thing it was that the narrative was quite anti-Western, even anti-UN, was against the deployment of UN troops, etc. contingent. But it was, I actually have worked a lot to establish the contacts between to understand if there are contacts between this site and Russians and direct links. And actually it was quite difficult because I found some information, vague information saying yes, the narratives are the same, etc., but it's not direct, And the direct confirmation of the fact that they work for the Russians and with the Russians was the fact that once in it was February 2022, if I'm not mistaken, they published an article, and it's in French, obviously, and in the word Républicain, it's Republican, instead of having N, they have Cyrillic letter T. It was a misspelling, which means basically we can assume that either the content was written by Russians or Russians were introducing some changes and just forgot to change the keyboard layout, and it appeared it was published on the website. They have then changed it, but I have a capture screen capture of this event, and it was actually the Sometimes you can establish like the direct liaison with the, direct liaison, for example, with the Russians through some small errors that may slip here and there.
We see the same in Polish. If you go on Twitter, you can find some, weird Polish use in some on some Twitter accounts. Any question, any comment from you, sir?
Something to add about the Wagner model. You have now you have several Wagners in the world. The second one, very important, maybe for the future more important than Wagner, is the Turkish equivalent of Wagner. The name is Sadat, S-A-D-A-T, Sadat. Sadat is the out of Turkey external projection of the Turkish equivalent of the Revolutionary Guards of Iran, created by Erdogan after the so-called coup, putsch in 2016. And now we can see very clearly that in Africa, Wagner, Sadat, and Asdara, even Iranian, are working together, because when one is in one country, the other doesn't come. For instance, to this day, what Macron has done in Africa, let's be perfectly clear, they had him hated in Africa. He's seen as arrogant, etc. So maybe it doesn't explain everything, but it makes other penetration easier. And for instance, since last year, Sadat, the Turks, they have expelled us, the French military advisors, from Togo, and now they are trying to do the same in Niger. It's easier for them because they are Muslims. And the Turkish army is rather neutral or atheistic, but the militias created by Erdogan, of course, are not. And so they are helping them. And you see not only Sadat and not only Wagner, but you see the Chinese behind them. Wagner now controls Central African Republic. In the capital of the Central African Republic, you've got a huge server for the telecommunications. And the owner of this mobile phone server is the French Orange. Suddenly, Wagner arrives and the factory burns. Too bad. And they say, wow, what's happening? And so 1 week later arrives Huawei and says, maybe we can help, we are cheaper, it's better. So you can see triangular or quadrangular cooperation between those militias or a private military company and what they are doing together. Plus, just to finish on this point, in Syria, Bashar al-Assad has always been extremely careful to keep a balance between Russia and Iran. So as now Iran is training and financing and helping the local Shia or Alawi militias, there is another unit in the Syrian army named 555 Regiment 555, trained by the Russians, which is nothing more than extensions of the Spetsnaz or Wagner. I don't know really who is training them, if it's Wagner or the Russian special forces, but if it's Wagner, it's an extension by another name. So you have this international cooperation, and altogether there are let's say that there are 52 countries in Africa. They are in either the one or the others, the Russians, the Turks, the Iranian, in more than half of these countries. And now when you see Sudan, Central African Republic, now Congo, they are cutting the continent in two. So this is extremely problematic. And last point, now I'm sorry to say that because it's not politically correct. All that is presented to the African countries as a matter of French or British propaganda is human rights and the rights of some minorities in the population. African is a young continent. What do you prefer, to look at a Wagner video or look at some propaganda, blah, 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 the human rights, what women shouldn't be treated this way? Of course it's true, but they don't like it. So it's extremely, even now in the United States, even the youth gangs, they have, YouTube's, television, etc. They show the Wagner videos. Wow, it's cool. Africans, Americans, say, look, it's cool. Look at that. It's fun. We shouldn't consider that the public that is looking to these videos is composed only by doctors in political sciences. You have youth, they are 15, 16 years old, they are hot, they want to fight. Look at that. Have you heard the lyrics of the Wagner propaganda? I used to work in a factory 9 to 5, it was boring. Now I'm destroying tanks, it's fun. This is the type of propaganda they do. Of course, it's highly destructive for social, moral, etc. But the reality is that.
Thank you.
Can I just add up a short sentence regarding Africa and disinformation? We often try to analyze what we can analyze, basically the social media and the conventional media. But at the same time, we often overlook the radio. And in some countries, and especially in some parts of the African countries, radio is the one of the most important medium existing. And we were not really analyzing what's happening there.
Okay, let me stop this French offensive for a minute. Can we take the first round of questions?
This is a question for Ruslan, but maybe for our friends from France as well. I would like to ask about the reasons you think such groups like Wagner are not attacked by Western forces. I would like to refer to this probably famous incident in Syria when the detachment of Wagner was obliterated from the air. And these were Americans, of course, and it was strangely enough under the presidency of Donald Trump. And it put Wagner in the right way, in the right position directly afterwards, because nobody knows how many people died there, Russians died there. The estimates are from 20 to hundreds, as usually with Russians. And this is the question why the French are not doing the same in Africa. This is, after all, not a state unit, military unit. With Mirage and Rafale, you can obliterate them within 30 minutes or so, considering satellite reconnaissance. And I'm just wondering, because 30 years ago, or when Mr. Focard was Mr. Africa, French Mr. Africa, detachment, a company of second Régiment de Parachutistes would do the job in 24 hours. And now, still, France is actually is possessing all these forces, yes? But still some kind of political reasons are for not doing this and letting it actually not only the French, but also the Turks, the Chinese in. Of course, I'm not going to say that Africa it should be under French control, but still it might be done from the military point of view, if I am right.
Sorry, my poor friend, if only that was true. No, what you are telling was right. I cannot go in the detail because it's not public information, but roughly last year, a common car with Wagner guys and local Central African Republic were on a road in Central African Republic, and improvised explosive device exploded and killed those inside. Listen well, in less than 1 hour, a helicopter from Wagner was there. In 10 minutes, they had discovered what type of explosive it was and where it came from. If this capacity is in the hands of Wagner, I am the Holy Father. This information is controlled only by a state. Which type of explosive, who fabricates this explosive, etc. Then some cars, jeeps came from the capital and followed, because the border it's a very wide country, you know. So when you have done this bombing, the jeep that carries the guys going back to Chad nearby is maybe several hours of rough roads, you know, in the desert or something. So they followed those Wagner jeeps followed the jeep that was going away with the guys who planted the bombs till the border. They looked at them crossing the border. Then 1 hour later, a helicopter came. The guys in the jeeps were pinned to the ground, and it's a total mark of the Spetsnaz. If they want to immobilize a guy, they shoot a bullet in his leg. The first thing they do, they take the guy, boom, a bullet in the thigh here, and so the guys were found dead with the bullet, and they entered to the fort, Chadian army nearby, where the guys wanted to hide, and they killed everybody. They are extremely restless and dangerous people, and we, France, don't have the people to have the capacity to kill whoever they want on the ground like they do. You know, at the intervention in Africa, in Mali, it was under some rules of the civilized countries, which the Wagner guys. So when they arrive in the village, they say, you obey us or we'll kill you all. The Polish army can do that, the French army can do that, we are civilized countries, and this is the reality. You know, in less than one day, the attempt to start some kind of guerrilla war in Central African Republic by planting bombs and doing like some guys did in Iraq, for instance, with the Americans, it was stopped immediately because they have the brute force and the capacity to act and react immediately. I don't know how many countries in the world have the capacity to identify an explosive and say, yes, this is used by the French, okay, you follow the guys and they kill them. This is what happened.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I would like my country to be in a better position, but reality, you know, we are here to share information that are useful to everybody with the real facts. What I've just told you, the burning of the Orange, you know, the telecom server in Bangui, and the use of the helicopters to track the bombers and kill them, it is absolutely authentic. You can find it in the media because Chad reacted, it was an outrage, why did they kill? Of course, they didn't know why they killed them, but the reality is they killed the guys who planted bombs in Central African Republic.
Thank you. Ruslan, do you want to take this question?
Well, I was a war reporter for 12 years before becoming researcher at the Atlantic Council, and I saw many examples of how special forces are operating on the ground in Middle East and Africa and Southeast Asia. And for me, is why Wagner forces are not being attacked. For me, it's a problem because I don't believe sanctions will work with Wagner or any military unit connected to Kremlin. In my opinion, the only thing we need right now are special operations. Maybe a brutal, but these people should be eliminated, not sanctioned. Sorry for this harsh answer, but the people who are operating inside Wagner, they are not just people going for money. So many of them are believers. And working as part of military complex of Russia, I think we are already late with our answer. I mean, our as Europe and forces against Russia. This is why I believe we need more special operations and better equipment. But this is a question related to the problem with our stockpiles, because in Europe, you know better that stockpiles are nearly empty. And maybe this is also a problem of leadership, because this dependence of Russia before the war in Ukraine, it is very telling. I mean, we are living in the consequence of this dependency of Russia, and in every aspect of our life. So Russia is trying to reach the limit. They are attacking, deploying troops somewhere, and waiting for answer. We saw in Syria that not answering them have global consequences. And we have the examples in Ukraine right now because some of the Western capitals are not so willing to help Ukraine. This is the truth. So I wish to see more special operations against Wagner structures and networks, but unfortunately we are already late.
Any questions? Please.
Concerning this information, kind of comment and media warfare, I think that actually Russia depends how we define the aims, because in my opinion they are successful. Not here in power. They are successful where they want to be successful in the global south. Because if we move out from Europe, Russian propaganda, let's say, or Russian point of view is very successful. And to give some examples, part of it is actually also the mistakes made particularly by the USA, these blunders in policy connecting how to present the conflict and global terms. But let's say, in Western publication, there was a text about mass-grave military, US-style military cemetery in Poland for Polish mercenaries and soldiers dying in Ukraine, which is repeating Russian propaganda. But this was made in USA, but it was quoted by a rather serious researcher, actually, not by propaganda outlet, quoting quite serious Indian newspaper. This came from Russia to India, from India later influencing the Americans, like how they perceive that, at least some of them. So this is where the success is. The second example, just like 2 or 3 weeks ago in Indonesia, the president of the third largest democratic country in the world, technically speaking, rather pro-Western, let's say, and rather liberal leader. He said, we must build our own payment card network, like Visa or MasterCard by our local, because look at what happened in Russia. Americans turn them off and there is a disaster. We cannot depend on it. It may happen to us one day. We never know. So this is kind of like showing how the rest of the world, not we here, but the rest of the world reacts. I think this is like, there were some interviews from Africa about the China influence. Why we want them? Because they are cheaper. They build the infrastructure much cheaper. And they don't ask us, as what Professor here said, we don't talk about human rights. We need road, they build road, relatively cheap. Of course, the influence continues. So I'm not sure whether, and coming back to Russia, this is like, they don't strike us, they strike somewhere else, and they are successful there.
Any questions from anyone?
Question for Mr. Trad. Regarding the Wagner Group, there have been various comments, including from within Wagner's mercenaries, that they are not receiving enough. That they're not receiving enough equipment, mostly ammunition, for their operations in Ukraine. Is this true? And if so, to what degree? Are they really not being supplied enough for their operations?
Yeah, it was a reality on the front lines because after Soledar fighting, let's say that Prigozhin became a problem for officer corps in the Kremlin. So, you know, for this arguing between and the problematic discussions between Prigozhin and the circle surrounding Gerasimov, and it was the problem was solved after that, after I think intervention from military intelligence, but the problem is still here. That is one of the reasons why Wagner is transforming the logistical networks with help of sympathizers and other Spetsnaz units. There is a transferring of weapons and equipment from Spetsnaz units to Wagner and in the opposite way. So yeah, it was true, and it was a result of this internal power struggle.
Thank you very much.
So, if I may ask, let's go back to the humanitarian side. I want to go back to this issue of children. What is a legal understanding of operations of abducting or transferring children? And also, what is a goal of doing that? And also, who is involved? Is it a private initiative, or the government of Russia is also involved?
So as we know, International Criminal Court issued arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin and Russian Commissioner for Human Rights, Maria Belova. And the basis for that is transferring children from Russian-occupied territory to Russia. Around 16,000 children have been transferred, but we don't know, to be honest, the exact data. And the question is, why ICC decided to take that case? We are aware that ICC is not able to deal with every crime, and so it was obvious since the very beginning that International Criminal Court would choose some most important issues. So transferring children is the violation of human rights. It is the violation of Geneva Convention, because it is forbidden to transfer civilians from occupied territories to the third state. It is also, it can be the form of genocide also, and it can be also the form of the crime against humanity. And so in ICC statute, that kind of practice is included. Ukraine is not a party to ICC statute, but it declared in 2014 that it recognized ICC jurisdiction on its territory. Around 40 states parties to ICC statute asked ICC in March 2022 to deal with crimes in Ukraine. So right now ICC has the office in Kiev, and what is the most important, that the practice of transferring children is an official practice in Russia. It was announced by President Putin. Maria Belova, she was nominated to take care of the whole procedure. So it's authorized, coordinated on the highest level in Russia. It happened quite often that President Putin, he, for example, thanked Belova and also some local institutions which participate in this procedure for achievements, for results. So ICC has some evidence that it was organized and approved by the highest level. What is also interesting here that Russia in May 2022, that Putin issued the decree easing granting citizenship to orphans, especially, and some institutions assess that there are around 50 places in Russia. Also in occupied Crimea, in Siberia, close to China, really quite many facilities where those children are located. Some of them were adopted. Also, the Commissioner Belova, she also adopted one boy, if I'm not wrong. And those children are there is the process of Russification, support re-education, but also, especially in Crimea, military exercises are organized for those children who are on the Crimea. So it's a big problem, and but I would like to add that this decision, ICC, was also criticized, because on the one hand, it's legally, there is a legal base for that. On the other hand, Ukraine, for example, was disappointed that ICC didn't include the category of genocide in the decision, but it was the permission was that it was war crime. Some experts also believe that it's better to negotiate with Putin peace, not to talk about crimes right now. There was the dilemma, if you remember, with Milosevic and Srebrenica. So peace was negotiated with Milosevic at the same time. The crime of genocide was committed in Srebrenica in 1995, just the end of the war. So some experts also turned the attention to the fact that ICC is selective, that, for example, didn't raise the problem of some crimes committed by Western powers in Iraq, for example. But there was no legal link, to be honest, for ICC to do that.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to finish. That's the end of our panel. Thank you very much for all questions or comments, all participants. Ruslan, thank you very much. And now I invite all presenters to attend a dinner and see you in how much?
Yes, we are meeting here at 3:45.
4:45.
In 3/4 we are back. Thank you very much for participating in this session. And the last panel is going to be in Polish, so I just would like to warn you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.